The international system is facing accelerated transitions as competition between the great powers intensifies. Join this important dialogue with the Kingston Consortium on International Security.
So moving on to our panel 3 for today with women, peace, and security in conflict zones. To that end, I'd like to invite our moderator, Major General now. Cost me a beer, eh? It's okay. Major General Denis O'Reilly, commander of the Canadian Defence Academy here in Kingston, to moderate the next panel. So, sir, welcome aboard.
Thanks, Mike. Bienvenue à tout le monde. Welcome, everybody. Women, peace, and security in conflict zones. It calls for on-the-ground conflict responses to make gender equality and the needs of women and girls an integral part of their efforts during conflict, intervention, and post-conflict situations. If you had talked to me about women, peace, and security 5 years ago, sorry, let's go 2 years ago, I would have said I care about women, peace, and security issues. I care about women. I married one, right? And that's not funny, but it's a brutal truth. And so from the wisdom of other people and the academic research and leaders like Senator Patterson, who have stepped up to be bold and say this is important, not just from a mid-level response to making sure we got gender parity, but getting to, I think, a final solution or an aspirational solution that, and Dr. von Hlakty, please don't kill me if I get this wrong, but you created this monster from reading your book. I don't want to be co-opting a feminist agenda for the patriarchy. And those are your words, not mine. So
too late.
You created this monster. So in my effort to be a cosmopolitan officer, which is something else I've added in my lexicon, I'm very pleased to be here and very humbled, actually, for the panel members that we do have. So I'm not going to steal any more of their time. I'm going to introduce them very quickly. Unfortunately, Canada's Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security, Ambassador Jacqueline O'Neill, could not be with us. She had a bereavement in the family. Unfortunately, her father passed away at the age of 98. So for those of you who know her, we'll keep her in our thoughts. But we do have, and we're fortunate to have, Lieutenant Colonel Melanie Lake, who is the Liaison Officer for Women, Peace and Security at Global Affairs Canada. That's correct, Melanie? So welcome, and I know you travel with Ambassador. You travel with Ambassador O'Neill, and you're going to bring her points and your own perspective to this, so please do, and you're very welcome. We've also got, as I alluded to, Dr. Stéfanie von Hlakty from Queen's University, Dr. Yolande Bouka from Queen's University, and Dr. Yannick Veilleux-Lepage from the Royal Military College. So please join me in welcoming our panelists. And without further ado, we'll start with Dr. von Hlakty and work our way left to right, and I will sit down. Have fun.
All right, thank you for the introductions. It's really great to have this dynamic moderator right after lunch. And I'm really pleased that we have a panel dedicated to women, peace, and security, and gender and security more broadly as part of this conference. And at the same time, I feel like a lot was already said this morning with the excellent remarks of Rachel Grimes and Claire Hutchinson. So I was nodding along, taking notes, and thinking I have much less to say now because you're really introducing some points that I completely agree with. But what I'll try to do is to maybe bring a little bit of nuance there in terms of how women, peace, and security has been implemented in a NATO context and provide the academic view, which is very often a longer-term view. And I know that in the day-to-day, practitioners will face a lot of frustrations with the implementation of something like the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. But at the same time, when we look at the last 2 decades, and we look at more specifically how NATO has embarked on implementing the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, there are also some silver linings. And so while the book does offer some critical assessments of the way this agenda has been adopted, interpreted, and implemented, I also think that we need to take stock of how the agenda has also been institutionalized in significant ways in the NATO context. And so when we look at the machinery of NATO, I think we can see very tangible evidence for the policy taking hold, not only within the headquarters, but across the strategic, operational, and tactical levels. So I have done work on NATO for a long time, and I came across the topic of women, peace, and security a little serendipitously as part of a different research project I was doing. And in the headquarters in around 2007 and 8, when I was working on this project related to deterrence and nuclear weapons policy, I was struck at how women, peace, and security was being introduced as part of the official NATO narrative. And really, the argument about increased women's participation at NATO resulting in operational effectiveness was the argument du jour that we were hearing increasingly from both civilian and military leaders, including from the Secretary General. And that was around the time that NATO was adopting its policy and corresponding military directives. And to me, it was fascinating as a scholar of NATO that there was this big shift in narratives when it comes to gender and security, really embedding it in terms of NATO's public diplomacy efforts. But at the same time, I was curious to see, how authentic those efforts were and how deeply they would really take hold within the NATO structure. And so I set out to investigate this in a project that was 5+ years in the making, and that resulted in a book called Deploying Feminism, which was published late last year. And so what I want to emphasize here is something that Rachel Grimes shared with us this morning, is that you do have these overarching policies that are very often generally stated, and I think the women, peace, and security policy is no exception on that front. But then on the ground, very often you have the military that's in the lead of interpreting and carrying out those policies. And so the military will interpret it based on what it's meant to do, its existing lines of efforts, its discrete military tasks. And so the women, peace, and security agenda will be interpreted through that prism. And that's really the story of WPS implementation at NATO across its core operations. So you do definitely see evidence of implementation, but on the military's terms. And that's really what the book is meant to showcase. I want to take it a step back and talk about the institutionalization piece, because something else that was mentioned in the panel this morning is that women, peace, and security was not yet institutionalized at NATO. And I want to take a slightly different view on this topic, because I do think that when you look at the evidence, when you look at the presence of policies, when you look at the creation of positions on both the civilian and military sides of the House, you have gender advisor positions, which were alluded to at all levels, strategic, operational, and tactical, once again. But on the civilian side of the House, you have a special representative for women, peace, and security. You have a human security union that was talked about earlier this morning. You have funding, okay, albeit limited funding, insufficient funding, but you have funding nonetheless. Certainly Canada contributes to the trust fund. And so that is something that's significant, that's pushing the activities forward. And you have training, NATO-certified training that's regularly updated. Some of the training is mandatory, whether you're working for NATO or whether you're deployed in a NATO context. And then there has been, for over a decade, sustained attention by leadership on women, peace, and security, and it's been a consistent part of the narrative and the policy focus of the organization. So I think when we take stock of that and the slow process of institutionalization, there is still some evidence that this agenda has taken hold. This agenda is here to stay. And when someone as brilliant as Claire Hutchinson comes in as the special representative for women, peace, and security, does great work for 3 years and leave, that work carries on. And to me, that's the most tangible manifestation of institutionalization, is with even the departure of individuals who are committed And yes, a part of the agenda is personality driven to a certain extent, yet, the core stays, and we can build on that. We can build on those contributions beyond a 3-year mandate or a 6-year turn at a particular position. So I wanted to emphasize that because I do think that, from the lens of a political scientist or someone who studies international organizations, that is something that we can see, and that's something that's been enduring. I think a lot of our conversation here, and I don't want to blow past the 10-minute mark, I think we'll focus more on the execution of it. We've talked a lot about policy. We've talked a lot about the gap between policies and how they're interpreted and then how they may be carried out. So let's talk about execution, and hopefully that serves as a good segue for my fellow panelists. But that's where I think that we need to pay a little bit more attention, because women, peace, and security really requires a longer-term view. And very often when you're focused on 6-month rotation or commanders being there for 1 year, a lot can get lost in transition in that context, and would be difficult to measure. If you're looking at advances in terms of gender equality promotion and embedding the needs of women and girls into your operational planning construct, which relies on long-term relationship building and trust, that's harder to measure over 6 months. And so one thing that I wanted to emphasize, an example of a successful case in my view that's been done in the NATO context that has helped bridge some of those barriers and difficulties, has been the NATO mission in Iraq. And I was lucky to be there in the first 6 months to see how the mission was set up and then how it evolved. But in that particular case, and that was really unique to NATO, and probably because it's a more recent operation, this was feasible, but women, peace, and security objectives and gender mainstreaming objectives were baked into the lines of effort, which meant that everyone was accountable. And by doing that, you enabled greater continuity so that it's not so leadership or personality driven, but that everyone's accountable for the progress being made on that line of effort. So I think that just by doing that, NATO set the mission up for success, at least in embedding or changing the mindset when it comes to how women, peace, and security might matter for the mission, and then really challenging everyone, across the J functions, to really pay attention. So there are examples of good practices, and I hope that in conversations together, and certainly with the expertise in the room, we can draw from those best practices and recommendations. Thank you.
So I should, before I start, I want to apologize in advance, Stéfanie, if I stray into the operational effectiveness argument. With 25 years of, trying to make the case to people around me of why I belong here and belong in this service, old habits die hard. So the first point I want to start with is that the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is not just applicable in areas that we traditionally consider conflict zones. Insecurity is rising, as are non-traditional security threats. And the very notion of a conflict zone is somewhat subjective. A couple months ago, we had the opportunity to meet with the executive director of the Native Women's Resource Center in Toronto, and she had taken the time to review our second National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security prior to that meeting, and she said it was almost laughable to her in the first few lines where we say that Canada is not a country in conflict. She shared that peace and security are foreign concepts to Indigenous communities in Canada who are born with a sense of insecurity, a lack of safety, with graves of children being uncovered, missing and murdered Indigenous women. So armed with this, with our third National Action Plan for Women, Peace, and Security that's under development, we're certainly taking much more of an inward and domestic focus, as well as looking at the international implementation. As security practitioners and as a security-concerned community, we understand that we're at an inflection point right now in geopolitics. Traditional security threats are alarming. We look at the war in Ukraine, China rising and increasingly looking to assert control over the South China Sea, and challenge existing international systems. But alongside traditional security threats, we're seeing an unprecedented rise in insecurity globally, stemming from non-traditional security threats. Two things that I would say are different now, even compared with previous very tumultuous times and inflection points, are these very, very global issues that we are all facing of climate change and the rapid paced development of artificial intelligence. So insecurity itself is on the rise in countries that are not in conflict. This is really clear. Speaking with people around the world during some of the travels I've been fortunate enough to do with Ambassador O'Neill. We were in the Indo-Pacific in the spring, and everywhere we went, people were raising non-traditional security threats, so climate change, mis and disinformation, online harm, tech-facilitated gender-based violence, pandemics, violent extremism, as the issues that were keeping them up at night. But after, so we visited Vietnam, Indonesia, and Singapore, and then we joined the Minister of National Defense's delegation at the Shangri-La Dialogue. So that's a security forum, ministers of defense from 30 plus countries. And in that forum, those non-traditional security threats were almost absent from the conversation. This dialogue was consumed with a state-centric focus and great power competition at the expense of more inclusive security discussions, integrating human security, non-traditional security threats, and the tenets of the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. There's a gap right now between how states are looking at security and what significant portions of our citizens, the global citizens, are looking at. And I would propose that Women, Peace, and Security is an instrument that can bridge that gap, connecting governments more directly with civil society and impacted populations. We will certainly need private-public partnerships to tackle these very global issues, increase civil-military cooperation, and the the Women, Peace, and Security agenda is already a model and roadmap for how to do this. There's 25 years of experience that goes into this in working to see that those most impacted by decisions are included in the decision making. This goes to the whole of society concept that Senator Patterson raised this morning. These non-traditional security threats are contributing to insecurity at home. If we look right now, disinformation is one of the most prolific tools of foreign interference that's front and center in Canada right now. We look at the role of Russian disinformation with the Freedom Convoy. We look at the news, our Prime Minister's testimony in Parliament just the other day. There are very prevalent impacts of foreign conflicts that are affecting us at home as well. The UN Secretary General Special Representative for Sexual Violence and Conflict was at our office a couple months back, and she spoke about a statistic that the demand for Ukrainian women escorts on online sites in Europe has increased 600 to 800%. So, no doubt that is probably happening here as well. So this is, a very direct translation of this sexual exploitation related to that conflict that is impacting us here at home. I would ask, and especially looking at senior military officers in this forum, when you are in these hard security forums and you have that platform, raise these issues, because the traditional and non-traditional security threats are intrinsically linked. So why WPS now and why in conflict zones? In an increasingly polarized world and facing growing insecurity, we must find functional ways to cooperate outside of the circle of so-called like-mindeds. WPS is an area where we can cooperate, even in the defense realm, outside of our normal partners, and build really key relationships and trust that will be critical as we tackle other emerging threats. It's a safe space for cooperation, sharing, and training. I think back again to our time in the Indo-Pacific, where we're looking at a country like Vietnam and building our partnerships there. This is a country that we can't fully share and cooperate in traditional defense realms, but as this is a country that's balancing partnerships with Russia, China, the U.S., Canada, but WPS is an area where there certainly is space, and that builds trust, it builds relationships, and it also helps us get into other really important forums that we're really hoping to leverage, like ADMM+. Right now, there's over 103 countries in the world that have national action plans on women, peace, and security. That's a pretty large group where we can find common ground, build trust, and build relationships. So digging a little further into WPS in conflict zones, war has historically been a time of both leapfrogging ahead in terms of gender equality based on the disruption to the system and sheer need, thinking women coming into the workforce in America in the Second World War, women in combat roles, women in Ukraine fighting in the Donbass in 2014. But it's also a time where there's a risk of real reversal of generational gains and progress, especially when there's a lot of securitized structures that form in martial law conditions, power is consolidated. And sometimes these exceptional powers that are granted don't necessarily dissolve at the end of the conflict. There's gendered dimensions to every single aspect of conflict. And if we use Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine as an example, the ideas about masculinity, a very certain narrow type of framing, has been really central to Russia's framing of their invasion of Ukraine, really centered on a strongman notion, equating strength with a very narrow understanding of masculinity, aggressive force. The idea that this very toxic notion of strength is going to win a war right now in this time of hybrid warfare is quite simply being debunked before our eyes as we watch the contrast between the performance of the Russian armed forces and Ukrainian armed forces on the battlefield. As Russia doubles down on this narrative, highlighted in some of their recent recruiting ads, like, "You're a man, be one, come fight." While they're doing that, Ukraine has been working intensely since 2014 to increase gender integration in their security forces on the path to Euro-Atlantic integration. And women are very, very visible in this war on the front lines. Things are far from perfect, but the efforts to increase gender equality since 2014 set the conditions for this critical whole of society defense that we're seeing. There's a real contrast as well as we look, one of the most critical external factors in the war for Ukraine in support is the support of other countries. And they are really leveraging powerful communication tools to maintain the support, showing that they're maintaining their humanity in the fight through things like, showing soldiers engaging with the population, showing women front and center, even things like showing soldiers caring for animals. This, in the information domain, against a backdrop of Russian atrocities in Mariupol, Irpin, and Bucha, it shows that humanity of those fighting doesn't have to be the first casualty in war. And in fact, battlefield success, especially in tough times, really hinges on human elements like trust in leadership, motivation, will to fight, and the maintenance of morale. And we're seeing this contrast play out in real time. When conditions get better for women in armed forces, things improve for everyone, but you also get a more effective fighting force. The most toxic elements of masculinity in war that Russia has focused on correspond very well with the things that make you lose on the battlefield. We know that Russia's security forces' apparent lack of internal unity is a factor in the presence of sexual and gender-based violence. We know from other places that low levels of internal cohesion within armed forces, a lack of social bonds, correlate with sexual and gender-based violence. Disgustingly, when fighters rape together, for example, it strengthens loyalty and cohesion within armed groups. So beyond the pursuit of justice and accountability for conflict-related sexual violence, which is an incredibly difficult process, we need to think about how we can impose battlefield costs for using these prohibited weapons. even if we are not integrating gender perspectives into our military planning, our adversaries certainly are doing this against us. I mean, again, you look at Russia's use of sexual violence, ISIS, 20% of the foreign fighters they recruited from the West were women, very targeted recruiting campaigns for Muslim women in Western countries. Boko Haram, 2/3 of suicide bombers are women, leveraging biases that women will not be searched to the same extent, leveraging children. Like, these things are getting weaponized against us, and we need, it's a challenge to our own professional competence to be able to do the same. So on conflict termination, again, a lot of focus on winning the war, but we need to think about who helps us win the peace. Grassroots women's movements, getting funding down. We know that these groups are going to be absolutely critical when it comes to demobilization. You look at Ukraine, you're looking at the challenge of trying to demobilize 1 million people at the end of this war. Women in communities in many trades dominated from women will be key. We're going to be seeing spikes in domestic violence. So we need to be prepared for this in advance. We've seen this in many other conflicts. And the idea that this inclusive conflict termination needs to involve dissolving these securitized structures that often see women excluded. I think the downfall of many military campaigns of this century has been the failure to plan for the day after the war ends. And embracing WPS and some of these principles safeguards against this and leads to far better preparation. So in summary, this is relevant beyond conflict zones as we're dealing with an unprecedented rise in insecurity and range of emerging security threats. And we need to leverage these functional areas of cooperation to build those relationships and trust that we'll need in crisis moments for other issues. Integrating WPS leads to a better understanding of the situation and what actions can actually lead to more positive outcomes. It's not just a war-winning formula, but perhaps more importantly, a peace-winning formula. And finally, in a time of rising authoritarianism worldwide, this agenda, inclusive to its core, is a powerful tool to fight back and also to ensure that democracy is not the first casualty in the fight to defend democracy. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for my co-panelists for their presentation. It's a pleasure to be among you. My name is Yolande Bouka, and I'm a professor at Queen's University. I currently teach international relations and gender and politics. Prior to my appointment, I worked for a South African-based think tank focused on security in Nairobi. And I want to take you a little bit to what I used to do to kind of inform some of my reflections today. My portfolio was diverse. I was primarily in charge of conflict prevention and risk analysis in the African Great Lakes region. We're talking about Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, and the DRC. And my secondary role was to help develop and sustain programming on WPS at the Institute for Security Studies. And so one of my first projects on women's involvement in security was a study of the Kenyan Armed Forces and women's integration in that institution. Since my return to academia, I've remained active in policy and security conversations. I'm often asked to reflect on issues related to WPS in Africa. Some of the questions that are often asked are, what do the women and girls need in countries XYZ? Often the usual answers are linked to, well, what's happening with regards to displacement, increased vulnerabilities to sexual violence, as mentioned, lapse in education, intimate partner violence, and preventable communicable diseases, like anywhere else where you've had instability. There's also often conversations about the work that local women engage in sensitive populations, and the work they do in sensitizing the community, government, NGOs, and international partners. Unfortunately, We know that they do a lot of work, but we often forget to compute that type of labor, the resources and the capital they spend on such efforts when evaluating and monitoring women, peace and security work in those regions. So this is actually a good way to take the temperature and the pulse of work already ongoing, the needs that are already manifested or explicitly defined by communities on the ground, as opposed to coming in and trying to reinvent the wheel. There's also discussions about the types of instruments that the international community, regional organizations, or national entities use to address women and girls' specific needs, and whether there have been ways to operationalize these policies and resolutions in terms of the mandate that either the UN or, in the context that I work in, the African Union missions and other types of multinational and multidimensional missions put in place. So in my view, in my limited experience, we go through kind of these cycles of information, surprise, outrage, advocacy, then mobilization, drafting of documents, often ad hoc, and then congratulations. So, we did a good job. And in the process, if we examine closely the ways in which women out there suffer differently in conflict zones and conflict-affected zones, we probably want to rethink that cycle, and as been mentioned by my co-panelists, the need to think long-term, but also to think in preventative ways. So what I'd like to do in the next 5 minutes that I have or so is to provide an alternative way of thinking about one of the 4 pillars of the WPS agenda. You have the 4 pillars, and I'm sure you know them, and if you've heard about them: participation, prevention, protection, relief, and recovery. I want to focus on prevention because I think many governments spend quite a bit of time in thinking about how to include women in participation in military institutions. I think this is what a lot of the conversation is about. There's also there's a lot of contribution about masculine logics of protection. You have to protect somebody out there, and that legitimizes intervention. And we've also been pretty good at relief and recovery. We don't do it well, but we do it a lot. And that makes taxpayers and political teams feel a lot better about what's happened on the ground. I want to think about prevention beyond the incredible work that's already been done by the African Union, UN Women, and Women's Voice and Leadership, which is a Canadian-funded program, the work that these institutions and programs are doing in training women mediators and local leaders. I want to think about prevention in a way that thinks about world systems and the ways in which women in the Global South, in these interventions particularly, play an important role in trying to withstand the vulnerabilities that they suffer as girls and women in conflict-affected societies. So I want to think about the hierarchies of womanhood when we're looking at the Women, Peace, and Security agenda. Which women are talking, which women are we listening to, and which women are often acted upon. And not to say that there are some women that don't have agency, but in the system of hierarchies of fundings and decision-making and agenda setting, I think that we need to think about those structures in order to push the agenda a little further. So in order to think about prevention, the prevention pillar, I will briefly touch on 2 things, one of which has already been addressed by numerous panelists today, and that is climate change. In 1989 or 1990s, I participated in my first climate change march, back when I was in 3rd grade, if I remember correctly, and I thought that my placard, which was the specs for an air scrubber, would change and revolutionize the world. 30 years later, we meet annually as countries to discuss how consumption patterns are destroying our ecosystems. Even more, our governments and defense institutions have spoken numerous times about how climate emergencies will influence world security. For example, in 2016, the Obama administration, the US Department of Defense, issued a memo and talking about how, and that was not the first memo, by the way, there were a lot of other memos before that, talking about how climate change was going to change the security landscape. Many in the industry consider now it's no longer a surprise. It's quite routine to talk about climate change as a threat multiplier. Threat multiplier to our security forces in terms of deployment, increased deployment, but also impacting the working conditions of our troops. I think more attention should be paid to leading emitting countries, and we are one of them, and the lead emitters and the lead consumers of fossil fuel, and that's often militaries. So if you are interested, Netta Crawford published a book recently in 2022 called The Pentagon, Climate Change and War at MIT Press that does fantastic work at looking at how militaries are very large emitters of carbon. So this is one way in which we can think about this. When we're thinking about climate change, we don't only want to think about the ways in which climate change will then lead to more displacement, the ways in which it will multiply threats to our security, but also looking at how our military institutions, are in fact contributing to those disruptions. The second point and final point that I want to address, still looking at this different way of looking at the prevention pillar, is the equality of all humans, the equality of the value of all lives. A few days ago, the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, talked about the importance of gender equality and how much work they had put forth to achieve a high level of equality at the higher echelons of the United Nations, and the work that remained to be done to distribute that level of equality across the institution. This particular speech was in contradiction, unfortunately, with a police officer who a few months ago accidentally struck and killed a young woman, a young student in Seattle, and talked about the fact that she had limited value. In 2020, I published a chapter in a book edited by Dr. Megan McKenzie and other feminist scholars to think about creative ways to end wars in our societies. It actually addressed the value of lives. It addressed the value of lives of people from the global south, and it talked about creating or thinking about foreign policies that assess the value of Black and brown lives to the same level as values of white lives in North America and Europe. If you assess these lives with the same level of values, the type of policies that you may develop, the type of deployments, the types of weapons you will use on the ground may be different. So I conclude with the image of Derna in Libya, where 10,000 people are dead or missing as a result of intense flooding due to dams bursting. There's a significant responsibility to lay at the feet of poor governance in the country. But when I use the lens of prevention, I think of scientists and those who have confirmed that the rainfall that was in the region that impacted parts of Europe as well, and that landed on Libya, was the result of climate change. I think we can think about preventing differently. Because soon, if we don't mobilize, we will again be tied to the cycles of relief and recovery without solving deep problems. I can't help but thinking about Libya, but also in the context of the Sahel, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, and the impact that quick foreign policy gains had on an entire generation of boys, men, women, and girls in North Africa and the Sahel. I conclude with an invitation for more capacious conflict prevention policies through actions, through serious examination of societal and military emissions, and through the development of foreign policies as if people in the global south's lives mattered. Thank you.
All right. So I think my presentation fits quite nicely with some of the comments that were made by Colonel Lake about the different natures of conflict zone, particularly because my research focuses on online extremism and how women seek to navigate spaces that are inherently hostile to them. The work that I'm going to present is a joint collaboration with colleagues of mine at the University of Monash, Alex Fellon and Aisha Lukmanoglu at Clemson University. And essentially what we sought to do is better understand how women that were part of extremist groups navigated these online spaces through the use of what we can call everyday practices. Now, I'm mindful of the time, so I'm not going to go through the entire paper and the entire methodology. I'm going to try to focus on some of the insights or some of the things that can be applicable both in the sense of prevention and intervention here. But essentially what we sought to do is we focused on two digital platforms. The first one being Stormfront, which unfortunately most of you might be aware of. It's kind of like the OG extremist white nationalist site. It's existed for nearly 20 years now. And the other one is Telegram, which for many years was a preferred platform for the Islamic State. And in each of these spaces, what we see is we see gender segregated spaces. So in Stormfront, amongst the various sub-forum, you've got one named the Women's Forum. It's been active for about 20 years. And this is a space where white nationalist women can come and discuss amongst themselves. We obtained data from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and what is quite spectacular with this data is that because Stormfront has been taken offline on many occasions, very few researchers have the full scope of data that we have. But essentially what we've got is about 35,000 individual posts over a 14-year period, which allows us to kind of track how topics and discussions have emerged over the period. Posters on Stormfront, the Women's Forum, come from all over the world, but largely from the English-speaking world, the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. The second platform that we looked at was a Turkish language ISIS forum named the Women's Dawa, and we did a 1-year collection of this data, about 8,000 distinct messages that were hand translated by Aisha. Again, global participation, but in many ways, global participation in the sense of where the people were posting from, but largely Turkish speakers, Turkish nationals. What we ended up doing is using a machine learning algorithm, a topic modeling algorithm called LDA. And essentially what LDA does is that it can look at a very large corpus of data and identify different words that fit on particular topics. So here's an example of something that's quite mundane, somebody who's talking about their car being repossessed. And what you can see in this text here is a difference of essentially different types of topics in this piece of textual artifacts. So first of all, the first topic having to do with vehicles, so car, vehicle finance. The second one having to do with collections, so collection agency recovery, and the last one having to do with correspondence, letter, sent, receipt. Essentially, the idea behind this allows us to analyze extremely large corpus of data while protecting our time, but also our mental health, because nobody needs to read 40,000 posts on Stormfront. What was quite interesting in this, though, as far as kind of breaking down the analysis of what was being talked about here, is that we saw a lot of crossover in the topics that were being discussed in these two platforms. Crossover topics are identified here with asterisks, but we did see some fairly interesting difference in the saliences of these topics. And I'm going to kind of go into some of the main findings here in a second, but for us, the initial finding here is that there is something that is similar in the way these women are using these digital spaces that is distinct of ideology itself. So the first thing that we found that was quite interesting is the sheer amount of effort that moderators were going through in order to keep these online spaces gender segregated. We did a series of little tests. For example, we tried logging into these spaces using usernames that would denote that we were male users. And what we saw is they were extremely quick at removing our accounts and banning our accounts. Similarly, where we tried to access kind of the more mainstream ISIS forum using a username that would denote us as female users, we were also very quickly removed from these spaces. We've also seen that there was an extremely clear effort by Stormfront to do so and to create other spaces where mingling between genders could occur. So for example, in the early days of the Women's Forum, Stormfront had an issue with a lot of young men or men trying to go onto the women's forum in order to find partners. And the response here was from Stormfront to create a new forum, which would be a dating forum, as a way of kind of protecting this space as a gender segregated space. So this essentially leads us to believe that both these organizations sees a clear value in having a gender segregated space, or a space for women to discuss various issues by themselves. Essentially a kind of operational need, if you will, just given the sheer amount of effort that has come in keeping this. The second thing that we found quite interesting is the role of ideology within these forums. Mostly what we've noticed is that ideology was more present, or mostly what we found is that ideology was present in almost all the discussions that were being had. Even when individuals were discussing topics that we originally saw as inherently mundane, ideology had a very, very important role in it. So in one of the examples here, there's somebody talking about their dating life and their new partners. And in this, at the end, the poster talks about how their new partner is a soldier, which is worrisome, but also has a David Lane tattoo. And for those who know, David Lane is the white nationalist who coined the 14 words. We also see, for example, in conversation about aftercare for female genital mutilation, that there's conversations about what is seen as permissible by religion, by ideology, as being intrinsically important. The main difference here, however, is that because women within Stormfront are able to access the rest of the website, and there's places where they can talk about ideology, there was less conversation about the ideology itself. Whereas for women in Women's Dawa, there were conversations about ideology. They were trying to make sense of the ideology. They were trying to kind of debate and ask questions and essentially seek validation of the ideology amongst themselves, because they weren't able to interact with their peers or their male peers online. The other aspect that we thought was particularly important, this is the one that I think is particularly crucial when we start thinking about intervention, has to do with the role of these forums as digital support groups. The vast majority of the conversations that we were seeing in these forums, as I said, had ideological bent to it, but were much closer to kind of the mundane topics that we could think of. One of the most common threads was the pregnant trying to conceive threads, where women would seek advice, talk about pregnancies, but also in many ways console each other in cases of miscarriage or so on. And that we thought was particularly important, because we can see the kind of we've talked about the operational need of this site, but we can also see how this has a very important role as far as like social bonding and the creation of social networks. Similarly, we saw a lot of conversation where individuals were talking about the difficulties they were facing in their community as a result of their ideology, and therefore trying to seek kind of closer kinship ties with other people that had the same type of ideology, because they had lost kinship ties to their families and friends and so on, as one of the posters has identified. And I do think here there's a couple of fairly important implications when we're kind of talking or thinking about the role of gender and extremist space. The first one is that these websites serve a particularly strong operational benefits for these groups. They're a means of on-ramping individuals that may hold some of these ideas and may seek validation or may seek larger kind of kinship ties, go onto these websites and starts getting what Richard English has called in his work inherent rewards. So individuals, there's the role of ideology that is important, but what's also important here is we can see that individuals are actually creating very strong connections and get kind of brought into the movements further, not only because of the ideology, but because of what these digital online space gives them as far as benefit, kinship, understanding, and so on. I think this also has fairly important implication when it comes to off-ramping. So we can see how these websites can be used for on-ramping. On the off-ramping side, we know that Western countries have spent a considerable amount of money working on, if you want, counter-messaging efforts, trying to de-radicalize individuals by attacking the ideology itself. What we're seeing in this research, that while ideology is important, there is this larger piece of the puzzle, which is creating a safe space for these people, creating a space where they can seek answers to their question, creating a space where they can create extremely strong social ties. And I do think in that case, when we're starting to think about ways to off-ramp extremist women, it's quite important that we think about the larger aspect of these groups and what partnership or if you want, familiarity within this ideology means to them, not only in the ideological sense, but also on kind of a more ontological sense. So this gives you kind of a very large-scale survey of this particular research project we've done. The research has recently been published, so if you guys are interested in hearing a bit more about this, you can access the 3 papers that have come out of this research project, which are all open access, and I welcome any questions that you may have about this topic and the wider implication of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists, and we'll open it up to questions now. We'll get the mics going. We got a question over here in the front corner, and we got a question from the director.
Hi, my name is Claire Parsons. I'm with the CIDP. I have a question specifically for Dr. Veilleux-Lepage. Just based on the research that was just presented, I specialized in radicalization and counterterror in my master's degree, and also spent a frustrating amount of time on Stormfront. So you have my deep sympathies. What I'm fascinated with your research in particular is what you think the background of the segregation of women on sites like this with the associated ideology of obedience and submission to man to partner to husband. There's as I'm sure you know, a rise of the trad wife movement, traditional wives. And in the radicalization and de-radicalization process where these women are given so much agency on these forums to talk about ideology and engage in this sort of academic space, if you can call it academic, how does that agency play alongside the ideology? And what does that mean for the security of those women? Do they face, greater risks within the movement for intimate partner violence or even violence from militias if they choose to become more and more engaged and outspoken?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question, and the basis for a doctoral thesis, if you're ever so inclined to further that. I do think it really goes to the crux of our question, right? Which is essentially, are they given this space as a way to segregate them further within the movement, as a way of keeping them kind of subservient to the movement? Or is this a space that is kind of desired by these individuals? And this is particularly true within the white nationalist side. And we've seen kind of evidence of both, particularly in the old archival posts at the beginning where this presence was being created, where there was discussion about creating women-only spaces, and it largely came from women within the movement that then became moderators of that particular space. It does seem that part of it had to do with the fact that women within these movements are facing they're facing difficulties that are linked in many ways to their position in the movement, and that might not be shared with their male counterpart, and they wanted a space where they could discuss this. So for example, there's an extremely long thread, which is, what can I do as a white nationalist woman? And essentially, in this thread, they are trying to discuss what is the realm in which they can operate. And there's very, very strong discussion and debates within this space about whether or not their activism should be limited to the private sphere, the household, and this is where like the tradwise movement come from, or whether they can have a larger kind of overt role in the movement, either as organizers, as influencers, so if you think of like Lana Lockdeath type, or even as ideologues, so as people essentially shaping and creating ideology. And I think this is one of the thing that we are seeing happening in the space. But what's also quite interesting is that the moderators are definitely trying to push, at least from what we can tell, are definitely trying to push the type of, I'd say, acceptable involvement as one that is much more of a traditional private sphere involvement. Have white children, have more babies. This is your contribution to the movement. And there's definitely a pushback when, if you want to say, there's slightly more entrepreneurial women that want to break from those more kind of restrictive gender roles within the movement. There's a great wealth of data and research on this subject, particularly on the textual side, that has not been mined enough. And if you're interested in this topic, I'd be more than happy to share some of this data with you.
Do we have any feedback from the rest of the panel on this subject before we move to the next question? Just want to make sure if anyone else wants to bite on that. No? Okay, we've got Dr. Martel next.
Thank you so much. This was so interesting, and having all of these various perspectives on the topic is really, really fantastic. My question is for Melanie, actually. And I want to go back to what you said about the kind of shift to the Canadian approach on women, peace, and security, which is meant to kind of look inward. And I'm really, really interested in knowing more about what your experience has been when it comes to engaging partners abroad. And you've mentioned the Indo-Pacific, but perhaps you can bring in other regional examples if you're comfortable, of what the reaction has been to you or the ambassador sharing that kind of going inward impulse. Because you see that argument being thrown around, right? That the Canadians are apologizing too much for what's happening at home, that it makes us look weak from the perspective of our, other countries, and that's not a good strategy. But I wonder what's your perspective on doing that, and the kind of reaction it has elicited from other countries that you engage on WPS. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that approach, like acknowledging that we don't have everything right at home, is incredibly important when engaging with other countries, and coming at it from a humble perspective, and always from a perspective of we have as much to learn from whoever we're engaging with as we have to share. It's always framed in terms of an experience sharing, information gathering, mutual learning experience. And that's certainly an area where I think Ambassador O'Neill excels in coming in and taking a very disarming approach, really actively looking to learn and take home. I mean, nobody has a monopoly on the right answers in this space. And someone brought up earlier, actually it might have been you, the pushback on, like, this is a Western agenda that's being force-fed. And, one of the points that she always raises is that this was a movement born from the Global South leadership, Global South women's movements who came and advocated and brought this to the UN. I mean, Bangladesh was, I want to say, one of the non-permanent members on the Security Council who had a huge leadership role in this. So I think that approach is extremely important in countering the idea that we're pushing values. Like, this is something that women around the world have mobilized around. This isn't our idea. We don't own it. And the other piece I just add there is, like, sometimes I was curious, actually, going into these forums, how Canada's perspective and experience would be perceived. And the one thing I'll say is that, us engaging at a high level and raising these issues in high-level forums, it means a hell of a lot to the people on the ground who are working at the coal front of this every day. Ambassador O'Neill, like, when she travels, the first thing she does is engage with civil society. That's always the first meeting, so she can understand their perspective before going into forums with senior government leaders and security institutions. But, like, having that perspective, just incredibly important in those spaces. And having that high level engagement, it gets other people who generally, like, when we were in the Baltics last fall, our Estonian colleagues cited the example of they had a visit from Brigadier General Harding, who came from NATO headquarters to talk on WPS there, and a lot of senior leadership wasn't all that interested in WPS before that visit, but that was a prompting function for people to get briefed up, get smart on it, because they knew they were going to be discussing this at a high level. So that sort of, raising it in high level forums, visits and engagements where this is raised just helps. It helps the people on the ground get the ear of senior decision makers, and raises the profile of the issue. So I think Canada's leadership on it is generally well seen and important to the people working on this every day around the world.
Any other panel members would like to address that?
Just very quickly.
Please do.
I think the question prompted a really important observation for the broader discussions, which is that there's a gap between civil society spaces and then the higher level official diplomacy spaces when it comes to how Canada might be perceived on this question. And if we compare past iterations of the NAP with the emerging one, that's the result of a lot of consultation. Not to be ungenerous, but that more inward focus is not the government's idea, right? It's the result of really long-term and meaningful, slow, in a good way, consultation. So I think that it's important to ask, how do those perceptions differ between different groups, from more official diplomatic platforms to more grassroots civil society levels, and then questioning that and the reasons for why the NAP has evolved in the way that it has, and how it's being then received on the other end. And I think it's a really interesting evolution of the National Action Plan that your question prompted, and that certainly Colonel Lake's work and the various trips and engagements in different regions of the world bring a lot of empirical depth to.
I would add as well the fact that a lot of partners in the global South have developed their own national action plans, and some of them have multiple iterations of their national action plans. And the suggest that's on the ground, the research that's on the ground suggests that Western countries often have this outward looking towards national action plans, while developing countries are looking at their own challenges in terms of addressing inequalities. So this prescriptive approach that is often coming from the West is part of the kind of the backlash that it receives. So we've identified our problems, but you also have things that you need to be working on. Particularly when we consider the WPS origin is a document of transnational feminists coming together, and some of the very first drafters of preliminary drafts were coming from rebel movement, women who fought in wars in parts of Asia, a lot of Southern Africa, Botswana, I would say South Africa, Namibia. So a lot of their experiences through Sierra Leone and Liberia and other conflicts kind of informed as well the articulations of thinking about sexual violence in armed groups, their rejection when it came time to come to the negotiation tables after fighting for conflict. So there's definitely there was this disconnect, and I'm really glad that Stéfanie brought the point of civil society engagement in Canada, Indigenous women's group, and others who wanted to reclaim the instrument. So as part of the work that I do, I'm the co-director of a research network on women, peace, and security. And we have the opportunity to engage with those civil society organizations who are contributing, to ongoing conversations about the NAP. And I think that definitely opens the door for using a tool that is often seen as a foreign policy tool in a way that is much more useful for everyday security domestically as well.
If I could, just one piggyback point on that. I mean, it was civil society in Canada that called for the creation of this position of the ambassador, and civil society has a formal role, a formal advisory role in the both the development and the implementation of our national action plan. So the role of civil society in this can't be understated, and this is why I think it's such a unique approach where there really is a stronger bridge between civil society and government than in most other forums, and I think there's a lot we can learn from that in other security forums.
Okay, thank you. Senator Patterson.
I'm going to stay seated. So just as a comment, we're talking a lot about cultural humility, but within Canada itself, it's very hypocritical and very colonial to go out and tell other people how to do it right. And that, I believe, is a rightful criticism. And so that is why I say CNAP 3, it's very good. It's looking internal. But what I really do want to have a look at is very often we see by women, for women, but women are not the power brokers in conflict. It is not the group that has the power. So even though in Canada we certainly have made progress, I'll use the military, for example, representation throughout and in powerful places with support of allies and colleagues. So what I'd like to get your perspectives on is, as we move forward, and while we will work on it from a Canadian perspective, just how are we as Canadians going to move forward and try and create allyship so it isn't, and I'm going to say just, but not in a pejorative sense, women talking about women. And I want to give you one example. When I was doing Operation Honor and Sexual Misconduct, and then Chief of Defence Staff was the first CHOD in charge of the WPS network. He brought the other CHODs to Canada, and we were going to do a roundtable with our civil society counterparts, who were all women, on both the WPS and sexual misconduct perspective. And this CHOD from a country that really surprised me, I was due to talk about where we were with sexual misconduct and integrating allies, etc. And the comment from this CHOD was, "Oh, stop now," to a Commodore, "Stop now." And I went, okay. This, we don't have time to talk about this. We have far bigger problems with PTSD in their police force. And that was it, and he moved on. So this is why when I talk about trying to create these allyships as we move forward, both internal and as we move forward, how are we building that into how Canada approaches WPS and NATO?
Maybe I can start. Yeah. One of the other ways I think about NATO as a place for socialization between different member states and allies, and certainly, if you peek into the international relations literature and of the constructivist persuasion, those arguments are quite prevalent. And I think that in the context of a broader discussion on institutionalization, that socialization piece is key, because it's understanding that NATO will provide kind of a baseline understanding, and through various levers, push the norms forward, or create a context in which countries like Canada feel empowered or have the right policy cover or hook to keep reminding their allies and their partners of the importance of this agenda. So in these platforms, and I've been part of some of these platforms where you hear this kind of pushback, this kind of resistance, Canada's role and voice is really vital, and doing some course corrections, but understanding that, in an alliance of, now 32 member states, the pace at the national level is going to be uneven, but that at least NATO provides that platform for socialization and learning. So when it comes to Canada's role, I do think it's quite important, especially on women, peace, and security at NATO, because it's been a consistent advocate and voice, regardless of who's in government, and has made the investments to back it up in terms of resources and in terms of talent. That is going to NATO to be pushing that forward. We've seen that. So we're doing a comparative study right now to understand the way that women, peace, and security has been implemented across different regional contexts through different international organizations. And I have the pleasure of working with Stéfanie and Yolande Bouka on that, so we can compare NATO, ASEAN, and the AU. And I think that is one of the aspects, one of the dynamics that we can see across the board in terms of the underlying mechanisms that we're interested in. Supporting those efforts, and this is another layer to our work, is that broader community of practice piece, is where, you know, all of the interlocutors come together from, you know, government to the military to civil society to academics. Not unlike this group in the room, by the way, you know, forming a community of practice around a specific topic is the same with women, peace, and security. And so even across these different professional divides, we're moving at different speeds, or we're saying slightly different things, but ultimately we have a common interest in a particular topic, and this exchange of knowledge and of views is really productive to support the official discussion that goes in the big and important forums that we don't always have access to as academics. So that's what I would say as a first piece in answer to your question, and then I'll see if my fellow panelists want to chime in as well.
I think the challenge as well is sitting with what we're comfortable with, right? So women, peace, and security is easy. It's an easy pill to swallow. And when the agenda started to talk about gender, with some resolutions that are focusing on gender and gender expectation and gender roles, and explaining why the women, peace, and security agenda actually talks about how different forms of masculinity can actually undermine the safety of men and boys, that's where people get very uncomfortable in militarized spaces. So I give you an example. A few years ago, I was in a meeting with African high-ranking officers to discuss some partners' priorities with how they define security on the continent. And, you know, we had a conversation like this one, and where I was giving a presentation. And, you know, you talk about gender and masculinity, and you can hear everybody's butts shifting in their seats because they don't want to be in the room, right? So, you know, if we want, because it's such a global conversation, at a time that we've mentioned, there's a lot of pieces moving, but there's also a lot of backlash with regards to anything that is related to gender. So at the same time, you have a movement, the women's movement, the LGBTQI movement, that is making progress in articulating the needs and articulating the problems and offering policies for solutions. But we're also in a global climate of authoritarian backlash across the world that is often linked with particular formulations of masculinity and the rejection of discussing the ways in which different gender roles and expectations, but also different articulations of masculinities may not be more conducive for inclusive societies. So when you start really putting the button on what we've been dancing around for the past few decades, it's making people uncomfortable in the room. So how do you get military institutions? I know there's networks, there are conversations happening in Canada, but even those conversations, depending on at what level of politics we're talking about, are starting to also get the fingers pointed at those conversations, as it was mentioned earlier, as weak policy, weak conversations. Then we're stepping back towards the goals that we have in terms of developing institutions, practices, norms that push towards inclusion and equality, and more towards practices, norms, and expectations that move for a harsher, less inclusive, and what we're starting to see in terms of nationalism and certain articulation of masculinity and the retrenchment of democratic spaces. So how to take leadership, I think, would be not to be afraid of the conversation and not to return and continue to move forward domestically. And I think there are voices and there are people who are doing that. And then that, I'm sure, can continue to have an influence in that particular space, but it's conversations that are happening simultaneously and forces that are at the moment in flux. And we see that it's quite tangible a little bit everywhere.
If I could, and I'm almost hesitant to raise this one, but when you talk about building allies and allyship, like sometimes it is important to meet people where they're at. And this is where I feel like the operational effectiveness argument in military forums can be an entry point. It can be an entry point to, it's a challenge to people's military competence, to your analytical capabilities, to your ability to plan and be more effective, to integrate the things that our adversaries are using against us. And I know that, this is, there is a very real argument of the military co-opting this agenda, but, sometimes if you can get people on board with the effects-based side of it, the human rights side will come, the understanding will build, and you get that traction. The other piece with allyship is again coming back to like asking when people like you have platforms in these forums, raise these issues. It was interesting, Shangri-La dialogue I come back to again. Our minister was one of the few women speaking in the main panel, and during that session, there was a question on WPS that came up, and all of her fellow male defense ministers dodged the question, and the moderator turned to Minister Anand to answer it. Like, we've got to do better than that. Like, put your hand up, take a stab at the question. Like, that is important allyship. We know that one of the biggest predictors of whether a country is going to go to war with its neighbors is how they treat women. So there's no question that the rising insecurity that we're seeing right now is directly related to the fact that we're facing a reversal of generational gains in women's rights. One last point, like when it comes to allyship, I think for the military and security institutions, like opening up is critical. Like one of the best things about this job has been all of those opportunities to connect with civil society that I never had in my previous military roles. And it's incredible how valuable it is. Like we have to get past this idea of being closed, insular, and thinking we're the only people of value on the battle space. And as we start to open up more, I think like seeing that immense value, the allyship will come a lot more naturally.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions out there? We have time for one more. Okay.
Hi there, my name is Kate Todd. I'm a master's student at the University of Toronto, and I was wondering, in a time where we do have more constrained resources and we're feeling a bit of a pinch domestically, but also with our international aid abroad, if there has been sort of a retraction on the women, peace, and securities front.
Who wants to take that one first?
I can't tell you about funding budgets. I can tell you that when I was in Senegal this summer, talking with a stakeholder who works in the women, peace, and security field in the region, talking about reconfiguration of funding, how funding was allocated, and the very popular Voice and Leadership in Senegal was closing, right? So, I mean, that was one of the, kind of a sad story because of the impact that the program had on, many years. But I can't answer in terms of amount of money, but I know that the reconfiguration, however little is being offered, when it shifts or when it's withdrawn, it's felt, particularly at a critical time like this one. And I'll follow with the example of Senegal, because what people hear often about the country at the moment is conversation about whether the president will run for another term, which is kind of a little bit of a regional contagion at the moment, just to make it simple, because it's complicated. But that was, the way in which the political leadership was able to neutralize a political opponent was accusing that political opponent of sexual misconduct, of rape. And that instrumentalized the feminist cause and actually made any conversation with regards to gender quite unpopular very immediately in a country that is known for its democracy, but also its openness towards women. So I don't know about the fund, but I know that organizations that do lose their funding, that have a critical space over time, who lose the money at a critical time like this one, it has an impact. And yeah, so that's just an anecdote, right? It's not something that you can replicate in other places, but it's just an example of what happens when the money is lost and when the thinking about forward funding is not developed or baked into the giving of the initial grant, for example.
You go ahead.
Oh, so certainly funding cuts, there's a lot of pressure right now. Within global affairs, we're going through several rounds right now of looking at where money can go back to the center. The Women's Voice in Leadership program, that was relaunched in the spring, and it's certainly, it's an important program because it's not always just about there being enough money. It's being willing to take the risks to get that funding down to grassroots level organizations, the ones at the front face, who may not have, the ability to fill out the extensive reporting burdens that come with government funding. Lots of our missions around the world are looking for really creative ways to use, Ambassador O'Neill was just in Colombia, and they were looking at how to use some of their operational funding to rework it to target women's organizations. So there's a lot of effort right now ongoing to look at how do we change our funding allocation to put systems in place that allow us to take more risks to get money where it needs to go. Like they did a hackathon, a multi-day hackathon a couple months back looking at this very problem, like with civil society, with government, with lots of stakeholders, including end users. But without a doubt, like this question of funding, there's WPS awards that GAC gives out. They don't come with funding. And again, on the trip to Colombia, Ambassador O'Neill had a chance to engage with one of those groups that had won the award, and they highlighted like how valuable it would have been, but then also mentioned, oh, and by the way, we just found out our funding got cut. Another organization came into the office last week talking about their funding getting not renewed at the end. So it's a very real thing. But yeah, it's both having the funding and making sure it can get to the right places.
What I would add in answer to the question is that there's going to be some fluctuations and changes in the environment that will affect the extent to which women, peace, and security might be well-funded, poorly funded, whether there's going to be more actors resisting the agenda or being more accepting of the agenda. So from, I think, budget cuts to democratic backsliding, we can identify all kinds of factors that can impact the implementation of women, peace, and security and the extent to which it receives or doesn't funding. In the NATO context, I can tell you it's already not a lot of funding, so it probably flies under the radar, even with, budget cuts in national capitals. But what I will say, and this kind of goes back to my earlier point, is that even with these various factors and the ebb and flow of how they might impact a policy agenda like women, peace, and security, that's when the fact that the agenda is institutionalized to a certain extent with policies, with military directives, with positions, and with mandatory training, that's what gets the framework to stick ultimately, regardless of the other external constraints that might be impacted, the swiftness with which it can move forward. So I think that, so long as you've got that policy framework that's somewhat institutionalized in an organization or in a government policy, then you can bank on at least incremental progress in the direction that the policy has set out. And that's why the institutionalization piece is so important and needs to be foregrounded in the discussion. So yes, these cycles will happen. And I think it's important to pay attention to it. But I think that the agenda has reached a level of maturity in a lot of national contexts and in several international organizations to at least permit actors to leverage that to keep going despite some very real and difficult barriers.
Yes, John. Yeah, we got a few minutes. You got a question?
Sorry,
Quick one.
I'd just like to double down on that last comment,
say it's perhaps not just the ebb and flow of the financial resources, it's being present and taking the time to do the analysis. Because when the analysis happens quickly, you go to the default and the muscle movement that you're used to, and until it's institutionalized exactly as you just said, it will get skipped, and that's when we're at risk. So I just wanted to double down on the last comment because it's very relevant as a strategic planner. If things are happening quickly, they cut corners, and this is not a corner we want to cut.
Thank you.
Just on that, like that's exactly one of the things that, again, we're hoping to tackle with the next national action plan is that, you know, this is one of the first things that gets missed in crisis response. And that institutionalization piece is key. And things like the enterprise approach to GBA Plus that Senator Patterson was working on before changing jobs, like those are the things that put those systems in place. The other thing, you know, going back to what you were saying is that like having these national action plans in over 100 countries, like that's the policy hook that people can point to. We don't need to renegotiate every time that this is important. When the next crisis erupts and someone is trying to say, hey, we need to look at this, like they've got those policy documents to point to and say, I don't need to convince you that this is important. This document, this statement from our national level or from NATO or for whoever says that this is important and we need to get after it.
Excellent. So we're out of time. I just want to take a couple of minutes to summarize what I thought was an excellent panel. When I first saw the names and a couple from the same university and all in women, peace, and security, I thought we're going to have a very homogenous discussion. But I was very impressed at the tack that was taken from our different experts through a NATO alliance, from a national perspective, through an ambassador's eyes, through practitioners, and all the way into the mind of the women that we seek to make their lives better in other nations, right? Whether it's Turkish women or whether it's even women in the US who are being brought to places where their security could be jeopardized, and getting into the mind of how this happens. So I think we've covered a really broad spectrum of why this is such an important topic. And I'm incredibly impressed with the level of expertise and detail that you brought to this, all from completely different angles. And it's not what I would have expected, but it was a very pleasant surprise. So on behalf of everyone in the room, please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you. Well done.
Thank you, sir. Well, appreciate it.